Welcome back to Outlaw Operations. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling case filled with deception, greed, and betrayal. A story that seemed to be about love and ambition but ended in tragedy. Before we get into it, take a second to drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And if you enjoy true crime storytelling, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's settle in and get started. When LaToya asked about Ashley's whereabouts, the response she received chilled her to the bone. It was cryptic, cold, and final. "Ashley's gone bye-bye," they said. Those 4 words slammed into LaToya with a force she hadn't expected. Something was terribly wrong, she could feel it deep in her bones. Ashley wasn't the kind of person to just vanish without a trace. That eerie response only heightened her sense of dread. Without wasting time, she picked up the phone and contacted the police. It was that single call, made out of desperation and fear, that provided investigators with the critical piece they needed to begin putting the puzzle together. Once Ashley was officially reported missing, detectives turned their attention to her last known location, the home she shared with her mother, 46-year-old Mary Basil Tucker, and her stepfather, 55-year-old Purcell Tucker. But what they found inside the modest home would haunt even the most seasoned officers for the rest of their lives. Upon entering the residence, authorities were met with a scene ripped straight from a nightmare. Inside were the lifeless bodies of all 3 family members, Ashley, Mary, and Purcell. Each of them had suffered a horrifying fate that mirrored the brutal killings of the Harvey family just days earlier. The victims had been bound and gagged. Duct tape was wound tightly around their heads, suffocating them and amplifying their torment. All 3 had deep lacerations across their necks. Purcell had a sock forcibly shoved down his throat. Ashley's cause of death was determined to be suffocation, her face smothered with a plastic bag. There was no doubt in investigators' minds, this wasn't random. This was calculated. Cold. Personal. Despite living quiet, working-class lives, Mary and Purcell found themselves in the center of a blood-soaked tragedy. Purcell had worked hard as a forklift operator. Mary cleaned homes for a living. They were peaceful people who never made enemies. They were looking forward to retirement, to calmer days. But their lives were ripped away not by strangers, but through the betrayal of their own daughter. The connection between the Tucker and Harvey murders soon became undeniable. The puzzle pieces locked together when investigators found a damning clue: Ashley had been wearing Brian Harvey's wedding ring. The very one missing from the Harvey crime scene, taken from Catherine Harvey's hand. That detail was the linchpin investigators needed. The urgency shifted into overdrive. Law enforcement agencies across state lines collaborated, determined to stop the killers before more innocent lives were taken. Their search led them north, tracking the suspects back to Pennsylvania. On January 7, authorities cornered and arrested 2 men in Philadelphia, Ricky Gray and his nephew, Ray Dandridge. During interrogation, Dandridge was quick to throw his uncle under the bus. He claimed Gray had masterminded the murders, and that he had simply followed orders. But when it was Gray's turn to talk, what came out of his mouth was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Gray didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He confessed in excruciating detail to the murders of the Harvey family and the Tucker trio. His voice was flat, his eyes cold. As if recounting a story that didn't involve real human lives. As if the blood on his hands didn't matter. He said they killed for money. That was it. That was the reason. But Gray's story didn't end there. He told them more, about another murder. One that hadn't been solved. His wife, Treva Terrell Gray, had gone missing 6 months into their marriage. Now, he revealed her fate. Her body had been buried in a shallow grave on Brookside Avenue in Washington, Pennsylvania. She had lived with Gray and his nephew before disappearing. Neighbors had heard them argue often. There were signs of struggle. Still, when Treva vanished, the police dismissed it as a likely overdose. There was no real investigation, just assumptions. But Gray's confession brought it all back. Treva's mother, Manna Squire, had always suspected foul play. Now, her fears were confirmed. Her daughter had been murdered by the man she once loved. The trail of blood didn't stop there. On December 31, 2005, just days before the Harvey and Tucker murders, a 26-year-old man named Ryan Carey was assaulted outside his parents' Arlington home. His attackers: Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge. Ryan was beaten and stabbed repeatedly, left to die. He survived, but barely. He slipped into a coma for 2 weeks and lost the use of his right arm forever. It became brutally clear, these men weren't just killers. They were predators, moving from victim to victim without remorse. On February 9, 2006, the justice system caught up. Ricky Gray was charged with 5 counts of capital murder. Dandridge faced 3 counts related to the Tucker killings. Despite their confessions, both pleaded not guilty. The trial was long, stretching over 6 grueling months. But the outcome was inevitable. Ricky Gray was found guilty on all charges. For the murders of Brian and Catherine Harvey and their daughters, the court handed down a life sentence. But for the brutal slaying of little Stella and Ruby Harvey, just 9 and 4 years old, the jury demanded more. Gray was sentenced to death. After watching his uncle's fate unfold, Dandridge took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, no parole, no second chances. Even after all this, more charges awaited Ricky Gray. In December 2006, he was charged for the murder of Cheryl Warner, a 37-year-old legal secretary and mother of 3. She had been found dead, shot and hanged with an electrical cord, in the basement of her burning home. Gray pled not guilty. But 2 years later, in 2008, the case was dropped due to lack of consistent evidence. The crimes of Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge tore through families, across state lines, and through the hearts of everyone who heard the stories. What started with one cryptic message, "Ashley's gone bye-bye," ended in a trail of death, betrayal, and chilling confessions. And for those left behind, the pain still echoes. Ricky Gray's journey through the justice system was long, bitter, and marked by a persistent legal battle to overturn his fate. His defense team mounted appeal after appeal, arguing that Gray was not the monster he was painted to be, but rather a man who had been irreparably broken long before he ever committed his crimes. They pointed to a harrowing past, an abusive childhood filled with trauma that left deep scars on his psyche. Their argument was clear: this wasn't just about accountability, it was about a system that failed him long before he failed society. The case would eventually climb all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But there, at the highest legal bench in the nation, his final hope was swiftly dismissed. The court declined to hear his case in 2016, offering no explanation, no lifeline. By November of that same year, the final chapter in Ricky Gray's life had already been scheduled. The date was set, January 18, 2017. That morning came with a cold inevitability. There were no more appeals. No more delays. Ricky Gray was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center. As the lethal drugs coursed through his veins, the state officially closed the book on one of the most horrifying crimes Virginia had ever witnessed. His co-defendant, Ray Dandridge, wasn't as swiftly dealt with. He remains incarcerated at Sussex State Prison, serving a life sentence for his role in the same nightmare. But the true gravity of this story lies not in the execution chamber or the courtroom. It's in the echoing absence left behind. The brutal slaying of the Harvey family sent shockwaves through Richmond and beyond. It was a crime that felt personal, even to strangers. Over 1,400 people gathered to pay their respects at the family's memorial service. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a communal mourning. Outside their charming red brick home, a sea of flowers, dolls, and candles formed a shrine that refused to let go. The candles flickered in the night for weeks, placed there by children who never even knew the Harveys, yet felt the weight of the tragedy all the same. A neighbor, voice trembling, spoke of those candles. "We kept them lit for weeks," he said, because we couldn't let the light go out. Catherine Harvey's brother, Brian Culp, stood before a silent courtroom and delivered a testimony that left a lasting scar on all who heard it. He called the murders a lightning bolt to the heart. He spoke of the bottomless grief, of the haunting images that played over and over in his mind, the thought of what those final hours must have been like for his sister and her children. In Forest Hill Park, not far from the home where the Harveys had once lived and laughed, a small footbridge now leads to a solemn monument. It's carved from granite, bearing a bronze plaque with their smiling faces, frozen in time, untouched by the violence that claimed them. It's a quiet place, surrounded by nature, where the air seems to hold its breath. A place meant for joy, now repurposed by grief. But not every tragedy is loud. Some unfold in silence, behind closed doors, buried beneath the weight of expectation and the appearance of perfection. That brings us to a story of a very different kind, a story that begins in quiet suburbs and ends in heartbreak. The story of Lauren Stewart. To outsiders, Lauren Stewart had it all. A picturesque life in Keego Harbor, Michigan. A devoted husband named Dan. Two bright, college-educated children, Stephen, a data solutions architect, and Bethany, a gifted graphic designer. Lauren herself, at 45, was striking and elegant. A former model. A part-time personal trainer. The kind of woman who turned heads not for her beauty alone, but for her warmth. Her home was always in order. A heart-shaped wreath hung proudly on her front door. Everything looked perfect. But perfection is a costume. And beneath it, Lauren was unraveling. Years earlier, she and her husband had been members of the Jehovah's Witness faith. Devout believers. Loyal to the church. But when their children began expressing ambitions that included college degrees, they were met with strict resistance. The faith discouraged higher education, and when Lauren and Dan sought permission to let their kids follow their dreams, the answer was chillingly clear: go against church teachings, and face excommunication. Disfellowship meant more than spiritual consequences. It meant isolation. It meant being shunned not just by fellow worshippers, but by family, friends, and their entire community. It meant becoming invisible. Dan and Lauren made a choice, a brave one. They left the church. At first, it felt freeing. But that freedom came with a price Lauren hadn't anticipated. The cold stares at the grocery store. The whispers. The friends who no longer answered calls. In their small town, word traveled fast. Judgment traveled faster. And so, Lauren began to fade, first emotionally, then spiritually. She stopped smiling as much. She started spending long hours alone. Quietly, she began exploring dark corners of the internet. She researched ways to end her pain. She watched videos. Read forums. Purchased a Glock handgun. The transformation wasn't obvious. Not even to her closest loved ones. She still attended photography workshops. Still laughed at dinner. Still told her children she was proud of them. But inside, the light was gone. Then, one winter morning in 2018, that darkness finally broke free. Lauren Stewart shot and killed her husband Dan, then her children, Stephen and Bethany. She then turned the gun on herself. Neighbors were stunned. Police officers described the scene as one of the most gut-wrenching they'd ever encountered. The home, once filled with life, now echoed with silence and loss. Friends struggled to make sense of it. Some pointed fingers at the religious shunning. Others at mental illness. But no explanation could truly grasp the magnitude of what had been lost. Two stories. Two families. One destroyed by the hands of strangers, the other from within. Both left behind a trail of grief that still lingers in the air, like smoke after a fire. Both remind us that behind every smile, every closed door, every polite nod at the grocery store, there are stories we may never know. Some tragedies scream. Others whisper. But all of them deserve to be heard. In the small, tight-knit community of 3,300 residents, many of whom were devoted Jehovah's Witnesses, the Stewart family lived under a silent but unrelenting weight. Ever since they drifted away from the church, the reminders of their outsider status came constantly, not with words, but with glances, avoidance, and the kind of cold civility that cuts deeper than outright hostility. The community had made its judgment, and the Stewarts were quietly but firmly cast out. It was a form of exile that wrapped around their lives like fog, always present, always chilling. For Laura Stewart, this invisible wall was more than she could bear. Each day began with a mask, a smile, and a desperate attempt to appear unaffected. But beneath that mask, her spirit was unraveling. The rejection wasn't just social, it felt spiritual, personal, like being disowned by the very people she once believed would guide her toward salvation. The church's cold shoulder pushed her to a breaking point, and in search of something, anything, to reclaim a sense of worth, Laura found herself in the gym. What started as a coping mechanism soon became her lifeline. As she trained her body, she began to rebuild her shattered confidence. Day by day, she transformed. The physical change was striking. She grew stronger, healthier, not just in appearance, but in presence. The same people who once dismissed her began to notice her again, this time with admiration, even surprise. She leveraged her newfound strength into a job as a fitness instructor, and her natural beauty caught the attention of the modeling world. For a moment, it looked like Laura had pulled herself out of the abyss. Outwardly, she seemed cheerful, energized, optimistic. But that brightness was a well-crafted illusion. Inside, Laura was still drowning. Long before the church's rejection, depression had already haunted her life like a persistent shadow. Now, with the added burden of isolation and silent judgment, that shadow thickened. Her smiles were often forced, her joy performative. In rare, unguarded moments, her anguish would flicker to the surface, only to be quickly hidden again. What few people knew was that the Stewart family was buckling under a crushing financial load. Debt wrapped around them like a vice, suffocating and inescapable. It was the kind of pressure that keeps you up at night, that invades every conversation, every plan for the future. Laura, ever the protector, kept this secret close. But in her mind, it was becoming clear, there was no way out. She began researching late into the night, but not for help or healing. Instead, she delved into some of the darkest corners of the internet, studying methods of suicide and watching detailed videos on how to handle a handgun. Her plan was forming, grim, chilling, and tragically logical to a mind consumed by despair. Then came February 15, 2018. The morning began with eerie calm. Laura cleaned the house meticulously. She left a note on the dinner table and sent a final round of text messages, including one to her husband's boss. In it, she claimed that Dan had been in an accident and died. At 9:24 a.m., she walked through her silent, tidy home, turning over the family photographs on the secretary desk. Symbolically, she was erasing the images of what once was, the love, the smiles, the normalcy. The message to Dan's boss raised concern, but when the boss tried to follow up, there was no answer. Hours passed. Then, at 5:07 p.m., Laura texted her cousin. The message was chilling in its honesty. She confessed that she had allowed evil to take root in her heart, and that she had done the unthinkable, taken the lives of her family. She explained that it was not hatred or revenge, but a desperate, twisted act of protection. She believed her death would devastate them. So instead, she took them with her, so they could all sleep until Christ resurrects them. Her cousin, horrified, tried to reach her, pleading for her to stop, to reconsider. But Laura was no longer anchored to reality. She was drifting far beyond the reach of reason or rescue. What her cousin didn't know was that Laura had already acquired a handgun. And now, she was ready to use it. Her first target was her husband, Dan, a 47-year-old man who likely never saw it coming. As he tried to flee, she shot him in the head. He collapsed near the basement couch, one hand still in his pocket. It was clear he had moved in the final seconds, perhaps trying to run, or reason with her. But it was too late. With her greatest perceived threat gone, Laura moved upstairs. Her 24-year-old daughter, Bethany, was asleep in her room. There was no struggle. Laura ended her life with a single shot, muffled by a pillow. Then came Stephen, her son, who lived across town. She lured him to the house under false pretenses. As he stood with his back turned, unaware, Laura pulled the trigger again. A single shot. A mother ending the life of her own child, without warning, without confrontation. Even the family dog was not spared. Laura placed its lifeless body in the bathtub, perhaps to hide it, perhaps to contain the mess. A neighbor would later recall hearing noises that sounded like doors slamming. No one suspected the horror unfolding just beyond the walls. When the bloodshed was over, Laura moved through the house once more. She cleaned. She organized. She labeled items. The kitchen was spotless. The refrigerator was full. The entire home had the eerie odor of someone preparing for a guest, or a judgment. And then, Laura went to the stairs. She lay down. She used the method she had studied so meticulously. One final shot, precise, between the eyes. Silence followed. By the next morning, February 16th, her cousin arrived at the house with a friend. The unanswered texts, the cryptic message, it all felt wrong. When no one came to the door, they called the police. What officers found was a scene out of a nightmare. The house was pristine. Labels were handwritten, a calendar hung on the fridge. But in the bathtub, they found the dog. The fear of an active shooter sent adrenaline surging. As they moved through the home, they found Stephen first, shot while seated. In another room, Bethany lay in her bed, her life ended in her sleep. Downstairs, Dan's body was sprawled near the couch. He had died standing, trying to move, to escape. At the base of the stairs lay Laura. The pistol was beside her, the wound unmistakable. Her final act had been one of control, brutal, precise, final. 2 notes were on the dinner table. One for the medical examiner. The other was a suicide letter. In it, Laura wrote that she had allowed evil into her heart by rejecting God's love, and that it had made her sick. She said she killed her family to spare them from the pain her death would bring, that now, at least, they wouldn't suffer. That they would be resurrected someday, in peace. As investigators dug deeper, the story of the Stewarts became more complex, more tragic. Friends and neighbors described them as quiet, increasingly distant. Leaving the church had isolated them. And for Laura, the weight of depression, motherhood, spiritual rejection, and financial despair had crushed her completely. The woman who had once fought to reclaim her strength, had finally given in to the darkness. In the small, tight-knit community of 3,300 residents, many of whom were devoted Jehovah's Witnesses, the Stewart family lived under a silent but unrelenting weight. Ever since they drifted away from the church, the reminders of their outsider status came constantly, not with words, but with glances, avoidance, and the kind of cold civility that cuts deeper than outright hostility. The community had made its judgment, and the Stewarts were quietly but firmly cast out. It was a form of exile that wrapped around their lives like fog, always present, always chilling. For Laura Stewart, this invisible wall was more than she could bear. Each day began with a mask, a smile, and a desperate attempt to appear unaffected. But beneath that mask, her spirit was unraveling. The rejection wasn't just social, it felt spiritual, personal, like being disowned by the very people she once believed would guide her toward salvation. The church's cold shoulder pushed her to a breaking point, and in search of something, anything, to reclaim a sense of worth, Laura found herself in the gym. What started as a coping mechanism soon became her lifeline. As she trained her body, she began to rebuild her shattered confidence. Day by day, she transformed. The physical change was striking. She grew stronger, healthier, not just in appearance, but in presence. The same people who once dismissed her began to notice her again, this time with admiration, even surprise. She leveraged her newfound strength into a job as a fitness instructor, and her natural beauty caught the attention of the modeling world. For a moment, it looked like Laura had pulled herself out of the abyss. Outwardly, she seemed cheerful, energized, optimistic. But that brightness was a well-crafted illusion. Inside, Laura was still drowning. Long before the church's rejection, depression had already haunted her life like a persistent shadow. Now, with the added burden of isolation and silent judgment, that shadow thickened. Her smiles were often forced, her joy performative. In rare, unguarded moments, her anguish would flicker to the surface, only to be quickly hidden again. What few people knew was that the Stewart family was buckling under a crushing financial load. Debt wrapped around them like a vice, suffocating and inescapable. It was the kind of pressure that keeps you up at night, that invades every conversation, every plan for the future. Laura, ever the protector, kept this secret close. But in her mind, it was becoming clear, there was no way out. She began researching late into the night, but not for help or healing. Instead, she delved into some of the darkest corners of the internet, studying methods of suicide and watching detailed videos on how to handle a handgun. Her plan was forming, grim, chilling, and tragically logical to a mind consumed by despair. Then came February 15, 2018. The morning began with eerie calm. Laura cleaned the house meticulously. She left a note on the dinner table and sent a final round of text messages, including one to her husband's boss. In it, she claimed that Dan had been in an accident and died. At 9:24 a.m., she walked through her silent, tidy home, turning over the family photographs on the secretary desk. Symbolically, she was erasing the images of what once was, the love, the smiles, the normalcy. The message to Dan's boss raised concern, but when the boss tried to follow up, there was no answer. Hours passed. Then, at 5:07 p.m., Laura texted her cousin. The message was chilling in its honesty. She confessed that she had allowed evil to take root in her heart, and that she had done the unthinkable, taken the lives of her family. She explained that it was not hatred or revenge, but a desperate, twisted act of protection. She believed her death would devastate them. So instead, she took them with her, so they could all sleep until Christ resurrects them. Her cousin, horrified, tried to reach her, pleading for her to stop, to reconsider. But Laura was no longer anchored to reality. She was drifting far beyond the reach of reason or rescue. What her cousin didn't know was that Laura had already acquired a handgun. And now, she was ready to use it. Her first target was her husband, Dan, a 47-year-old man who likely never saw it coming. As he tried to flee, she shot him in the head. He collapsed near the basement couch, one hand still in his pocket. It was clear he had moved in the final seconds, perhaps trying to run, or reason with her. But it was too late. With her greatest perceived threat gone, Laura moved upstairs. Her 24-year-old daughter, Bethany, was asleep in her room. There was no struggle. Laura ended her life with a single shot, muffled by a pillow. Then came Stephen, her son, who lived across town. She lured him to the house under false pretenses. As he stood with his back turned, unaware, Laura pulled the trigger again. A single shot. A mother ending the life of her own child, without warning, without confrontation. Even the family dog was not spared. Laura placed its lifeless body in the bathtub, perhaps to hide it, perhaps to contain the mess. A neighbor would later recall hearing noises that sounded like doors slamming. No one suspected the horror unfolding just beyond the walls. When the bloodshed was over, Laura moved through the house once more. She cleaned. She organized. She labeled items. The kitchen was spotless. The refrigerator was full. The entire home had the eerie odor of someone preparing for a guest, or a judgment. And then, Laura went to the stairs. She lay down. She used the method she had studied so meticulously. One final shot, precise, between the eyes. Silence followed. By the next morning, February 16th, her cousin arrived at the house with a friend. The unanswered texts, the cryptic message, it all felt wrong. When no one came to the door, they called the police. What officers found was a scene out of a nightmare. The house was pristine. Labels were handwritten, a calendar hung on the fridge. But in the bathtub, they found the dog. The fear of an active shooter sent adrenaline surging. As they moved through the home, they found Stephen first, shot while seated. In another room, Bethany lay in her bed, her life ended in her sleep. Downstairs, Dan's body was sprawled near the couch. He had died standing, trying to move, to escape. At the base of the stairs lay Laura. The pistol was beside her, the wound unmistakable. Her final act had been one of control, brutal, precise, final. 2 notes were on the dinner table. One for the medical examiner. The other was a suicide letter. In it, Laura wrote that she had allowed evil into her heart by rejecting God's love, and that it had made her sick. She said she killed her family to spare them from the pain her death would bring, that now, at least, they wouldn't suffer. That they would be resurrected someday, in peace. As investigators dug deeper, the story of the Stewarts became more complex, more tragic. Friends and neighbors described them as quiet, increasingly distant. Leaving the church had isolated them. And for Laura, the weight of depression, motherhood, spiritual rejection, and financial despair had crushed her completely. The woman who had once fought to reclaim her strength, had finally given in to the darkness. An autopsy was scheduled today in Reno, Nevada, as authorities worked to identify the body of a woman discovered in a remote field on Friday. The discovery has stirred both fear and fragile hope within a shaken community. There's a looming, painful possibility that the body might belong to 19-year-old Brianna Zunino Dennison, the beloved college student who vanished without a trace during the cold heart of winter back in 2008. The field where the body was found sits quietly on the outskirts of the University of Nevada campus. It's a place that might appear ordinary to passersby, but now it's stained by grim possibility, less than 10 miles from the home where Brianna was last seen. For those who have followed her case, the location alone sends a shiver down the spine. Brianna Dennison was not just a name on a missing persons flyer. She was Breezy to her mother, a nickname that spoke to her light, her warmth, the way she could enter a room and lift its entire mood like a sudden breeze on a sweltering day. Born on March 29, 1988, Brianna had the kind of spirit that left an impression. She had dreams, ambition, and an insatiable curiosity for the world. She was majoring in child psychology at Santa Barbara City College, passionate about helping others, especially children. She adored animals and was never far from her dog, Aussie. But the brightness of her life makes the darkness of what followed all the more harrowing. It was January 20, 2008, when Brianna returned to Reno for winter break. She was home to reconnect with friends and family, and perhaps catch a break from the pressures of college life. That night, she went to a party at the Sands Regency Casino Hotel. Afterwards, she and her friends headed to a nearby house on McKay Court, just steps from the university. Around 4 a.m., she was seen settling down to sleep on a friend's couch. When morning came, Brianna was gone. The signs were subtle, but chilling. A small stain of blood on the pillow. Her cell phone, purse, and shoes, all left behind. It was as if she'd simply vanished into the night. But those closest to her knew better. Something terrible had happened. Law enforcement immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Forensic teams combed through the house. A crucial clue came in the form of DNA lifted from a doorknob, genetic evidence belonging to a man, someone who had no business being in that home. And that same DNA, as it turned out, had already been found at the scenes of 2 recent, brutal sexual assaults in the area. The profile matched attacks from November and December of the previous year. Whoever had taken Brianna was no stranger to violence. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the search grew more desperate. The community rallied. Flyers were posted, vigils were held. Over 1,700 volunteers, including Nevada's First Lady, Dawn Gibbons, searched hundreds of square miles of Reno's winter-worn terrain, hoping to find any sign of the missing girl. The FBI stepped in. A task force was assembled. Investigators began interviewing every registered sex offender in the area. But Brianna remained missing, and fear began to cast a long shadow. More survivors came forward. One woman, assaulted at gunpoint in a campus garage months earlier, finally revealed her story. It was becoming clear that a predator had been stalking the area, targeting women in a pattern that was only now coming into focus. Brianna's case wasn't just an isolated tragedy, it was the result of a serial predator moving in silence. Her family, broken but unyielding, continued to speak about her with love. They remembered her laugh, her fierce loyalty, her passion for cultures and travel, Italy, Japan, Egypt, France, just to name a few. A girl who once studied abroad in Rome, who connected with people effortlessly, whose heart was open and spirit bright. That was the Brianna they held on to, even as the world around them darkened. Then, on February 15, 2008, a local man named Albert Jimenez was returning from his lunch break near his office in Reno. It was just another quiet afternoon, until it wasn't. In a desolate patch of land not far from the heart of the city, he made a grim discovery, the body of a young woman. The autopsy would soon confirm what many feared but had not dared say aloud: Brianna had been found. The girl who had once lit up every room was now at the center of a homicide investigation. But this story doesn't end with her death. Brianna's legacy lives on, not just through the memories of those who loved her, but in the fierce pursuit of justice that followed. Her killer would eventually be identified through DNA and brought to trial. The community that once grieved in silence stood tall in the courtroom, demanding accountability for a life taken too soon. In the years since, Brianna Dennison's name has become a symbol of both heartbreak and resilience. Scholarships have been created in her honor. Safety measures have been implemented on college campuses across Nevada and beyond. And perhaps most importantly, her story continues to be told, not to dwell in tragedy, but to remind us of the preciousness of life, and the unwavering strength of a community determined never to forget her. The morning air in Reno was cold and unusually still. As Jimenez walked along the roadside near the outskirts of a quiet business park, something unnatural caught his eye, a flash of neon orange piercing through the tangle of discarded tree limbs piled in a ditch. At first, it seemed like just another piece of trash, maybe part of a Halloween costume or construction debris. But something about the color was too vibrant, too deliberate. He stepped closer, curiosity gnawing at him. That's when he realized, those were socks. Neon orange socks. They weren't just tossed in the pile, they were on feet. For a fleeting moment, Jimenez believed he'd stumbled upon a discarded mannequin. The kind you'd see in a store window, maybe dumped there as a prank. But the grim truth settled in his gut as he inched forward. This wasn't a mannequin. It was a body. A woman's body. A wave of dread rushed over him. He'd heard the news, everyone in Reno had, about a young woman named Brianna Dennison who had gone missing not long ago. Her face had been on posters, billboards, and flashing across local news stations. But the lifeless woman lying there in the ditch, she didn't look like the smiling girl from the photos. Still, something told him this was connected. Jimenez didn't have a phone. Without wasting a second, he turned on his heel and sprinted back to his workplace, E-Technologies. There, he called the Reno police, his voice trembling as he explained what he had just seen. When officers arrived at the scene, the area was quickly sealed off. Jimenez stood back, watching from a distance, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Then the words came from the authorities, words he wouldn't forget for the rest of his life. The body found in the ditch was, in fact, Brianna Dennison. An autopsy confirmed what many had feared. Brianna had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Near her body, investigators recovered a piece of women's underwear, one that didn't belong to her. There was also DNA. 2 distinct samples, one belonging to the killer, the other from an unidentified female. To seasoned detectives, the placement of the underwear seemed intentional, almost like a message, a mockery. As if the killer wanted them to know he was still in control. Desperate for answers, law enforcement turned to the public. They released photos of the underwear and urged anyone who recognized the item to come forward, hoping it might lead to a break in the case. But no one did. By January 29, 2008, police had publicly linked the unknown suspect to 2 additional sexual assaults that had occurred in November and December of the previous year. Another victim had come forward, describing a brutal rape that took place in a parking lot in October. With enough information gathered from the survivors, authorities were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect. Then, a breakthrough. On November 25, 2008, police arrested 27-year-old James Michael Bila from Sparks, Nevada. The arrest happened while Bila was performing a routine fatherly task, dropping off his son at the Stepping Stones Children's Center in Reno. The ordinary nature of the moment was chilling, considering the darkness that shadowed Bila's past. Unknown to many, Bila was a former Marine. He had a previous arrest from 2001 for threatening a woman's neighbor with a knife. He wasn't a stranger to violence. What led to his arrest wasn't just his background. It was a DNA match. Bila had previously refused to provide a DNA sample when questioned, denying all involvement. But his girlfriend had started to grow suspicious. During a trip back from Washington State, where Bila had taken a job, she discovered women's underwear in his truck, underwear that didn't belong to her. Confused and disturbed, she confided in a friend. That friend later contacted the Secret Witness Program on November 1st. Police began digging deeper. They collected DNA from the couple's young son to indirectly link Bila to the evidence found at the crime scene. The result was undeniable. The DNA from Brianna's murder scene matched that of the father of the child, James Bila. Further investigations showed that Bila had sold his truck in Idaho, a vehicle that closely resembled the one described by a rape victim just a month before Brianna's abduction. Authorities tracked down the vehicle and brought it back to Reno to process it for evidence. During a press conference on November 26, 2008, Reno police confirmed the worst. Bila's DNA matched not only the crime scene from Brianna Dennison's murder but also from one of the earlier sexual assaults. The web of his crimes had finally been untangled. On May 27, 2010, after a long and emotionally taxing trial, Bila was found guilty of all charges: kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. The jury took 9 hours to return the verdict. His defense team tried to plead for his life, citing a childhood marred by abuse and alcoholism, and portraying Bila as a once productive citizen turned prison model. But the jury wasn't swayed. Justice demanded more than empathy. On July 30, 2010, James Bila was sentenced to death. The court also handed down 4 additional life sentences for the previous assaults that had gone unsolved until Brianna's case reopened them. Through the years, Bila has tried to appeal the decision. Each time, the courts upheld the original sentence. The tragedy of Brianna Zunino Dennison is not just one of violence, but of the extraordinary strength that followed it. Her family, shattered by loss, chose to stand tall. They fought tirelessly for justice, not just for Brianna, but for every woman whose voice had been silenced. Her story echoed through Nevada and beyond, sparking conversations about campus safety, predator awareness, and community vigilance. Brianna's memory became more than a headline. It became a symbol of resilience. A call for change. A reminder that behind every case number is a life once full of dreams, laughter, and love. And in the darkest corners of injustice, her light, though stolen, still guides the pursuit of truth. We talk a lot about justice, but sometimes it's only when we lose someone truly special that we understand just how fragile peace can be. Brianna Zunino Dennison was one of those souls, a bright, fearless spirit whose life left a mark far deeper than most of us can ever hope to make. She wasn't just a daughter or a friend, she was the kind of person who lit up the room with laughter and kindness, whose absence feels like a cold void in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Her story reminds us why we fight for justice. Why we rally together when the unthinkable happens. Brianna's legacy isn't just one of heartbreak, it's one of unity, strength, and an unyielding refusal to let darkness win. Her memory lives on, not just in those who loved her, but in the collective fight to make the world a safer place. A place where compassion matters, where communities stand tall, and where violence doesn't get the last word. May her name forever be a call for change, and may she rest in peace. But Brianna's story isn't the only one that echoes in the silence left behind. Today, we turn the page to another chilling chapter, one that unfolded in Shropshire, England. The tragic case of Georgia Williams. Georgia was born on September 17, 1995, in the town of Telford, a girl raised in warmth and love, surrounded by her parents, Lynette and Steve, and her older sister Scarlett. Georgia was the kind of person who couldn't walk past someone hurting without offering a hand. That sort of compassion, that drive to lift others up, that was Georgia. But sometimes, the light in a person draws in shadows. In middle school, she faced her share of bullying. But instead of letting it harden her, Georgia emerged stronger. High school became her sanctuary, and there, she blossomed, becoming head girl, the heart of her school community, admired for her leadership and kindness. She was ambitious too, training as an air cadet with dreams of becoming an RAF paramedic. Her path was clear, her spirit unstoppable. At 17, Georgia took a part-time job at a local petrol station. It was just a job, nothing special. But it's where she met him. Jamie Reynolds. He was 22. Withdrawn. Awkward. Someone most would overlook or avoid. But not Georgia. She noticed him, saw the loneliness hiding in his silence. And in true Georgia fashion, she reached out. A simple act of kindness that would later cost her everything. Over time, Jamie began to lean on her, to find comfort in the only person who'd ever truly seen him. Georgia's acceptance, her willingness to include him, it was something he'd never known. To him, it felt like a door opening. And in his mind, he began to rewrite the nature of their connection. He mistook her kindness for something more, something romantic. When he finally confessed his feelings, Georgia let him down with grace. She told him the truth, she didn't feel the same, but she valued their friendship. Most would walk away with a bruised ego. Jamie didn't. Or at least, he didn't show it. But inside, something darker began to brew. Georgia, ever kind, remained his friend. Encouraged his interests. When Jamie said he wanted to quit the petrol station and pursue photography, Georgia was his cheerleader. She told him to follow his passion. And when he asked if she'd model for him, she agreed, without hesitation. That photo shoot was scheduled for Sunday, May 26, 2013. It was supposed to be just a few quick shots, maybe a bit of fun, and then she'd head back home to her family, who were hosting a barbecue. Her grandparents were visiting. Georgia didn't want to miss it. But she also didn't want to disappoint Jamie. That was Georgia, always giving, always putting others first. That evening, she got ready, jeans, leather jacket, a bit of makeup. Just before she left, her dad smiled and told her she looked beautiful, like Sandy from Greece. She laughed, said she wouldn't be long, and walked out the door. She never came back. Hours passed. Her parents waited. Her mother sent a text. No reply. The worry started as a whisper, but it didn't take long to grow into a scream. Police would later uncover the chilling truth: Jamie had been harboring violent fantasies for years. What Georgia didn't know, what no one knew, was that the quiet man she tried to help had planned everything. That photo shoot. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't innocent. It was a trap. In a matter of minutes, Georgia's life was taken in a brutal act of betrayal by someone she trusted. someone she tried to save. The town of Telford was shaken to its core. A vibrant, kind-hearted girl, gone. The investigation revealed just how calculated Jamie's actions were. He had lured Georgia to his home, knowing full well what he intended to do. He had a history of disturbing behavior that had flown under the radar. And now, it was too late. Georgia's family was left shattered. Her friends, broken. A community that once celebrated her spirit was now mourning her loss. But just like Brianna, Georgia's story didn't end with tragedy. It ignited a fire, a call to action. A demand for better protections, stronger safeguards, and real conversations about the dangers hiding in plain sight. These are not just names in the headlines. These are daughters, sisters, friends. Human beings with dreams, with laughter, with futures that were stolen far too soon. As we remember Georgia Williams and Brianna Zunino Dennison, let us not be passive mourners. Let us be their legacy. Let their kindness, their strength, and their belief in others push us to be better, to protect those around us, to recognize when something feels off, and to never ignore it. Justice isn't just about courtrooms and convictions. It's about never forgetting. Rest in peace, Georgia. Rest in peace, Brianna. You deserved the world, and though it failed you, your memory will forever fuel the fight to make it better. Georgia's mother had just received a text from her daughter. It was a simple message, letting her know that the photo shoot had finished some time ago, and that Georgia was spending time with friends, hinting she might return home late. The trio of kissy face emojis that often punctuated Georgia's messages had made their usual appearance. Her mother, accustomed to these messages, saw nothing out of the ordinary and dismissed the message as a typical, carefree update. Given Georgia's responsible nature, her mother felt no reason to suspect anything was wrong. As the hours passed, the night grew quiet. Georgia's parents went to bed, confident their daughter would return by morning. But when they woke up at 6:30 a.m. and saw that Georgia was still absent, a knot of concern began to form in her mother's stomach. She texted her daughter, asking for an explanation for her prolonged absence. An hour passed before a response came through. Georgia explained that she had stayed at a friend's house and that her phone was running low on battery. She assured her mother that if she didn't respond further, it was because her phone had died. However, something about the message didn't sit right with Georgia's mother. A quiet, unshakable feeling crept over her. The language seemed a little off, too formal, too distant. A growing unease began to fill her heart. Unknown to her, the message hadn't been sent by Georgia at all. It was becoming increasingly clear that something was terribly wrong. May 27th arrived, the day after Georgia was supposed to return home from a music festival she had been eagerly anticipating. She hadn't returned, but her parents thought nothing of it at first. Perhaps she had gone straight from her friend's house to the festival. They waited. As the night wore on without word from Georgia, her parents' anxiety deepened. Still, they held on to the hope that she would return home the next morning. She had been excited for her first driving lesson that day. But when morning came and Georgia hadn't returned, their fear turned into panic. They had no word from her, and the hours stretched on endlessly. Desperate, they began contacting relatives, friends, anyone who might have seen or heard from her. But no one had. Not a single soul had any clue as to where Georgia had gone. The silence was deafening. Georgia's absence was no longer just a troubling delay, it was a full-blown mystery. Her driving lesson passed, and still no sign of her. By now, her parents had no choice but to call the police, their hearts heavy with dread. They had to report their daughter missing. The police took their report seriously, launching an investigation right away. But the only lead they had was Georgia's attendance at a photo shoot at the residence of a man named Jamie Reynolds. The details of what had happened after that were unclear, and no one knew where Georgia had gone or who she had been with. With no concrete answers, the investigation zeroed in on Jamie Reynolds. They began digging into his past, and what they uncovered sent chills down their spines. Back in 2008, Jamie had been involved in a horrifying incident where he tried to strangle a teenage girl. Despite the severity of the event, the authorities had taken a lenient approach at the time, giving him a warning and letting him avoid any charges. But now, this disturbing part of his history seemed too relevant to ignore. As suspicions about Jamie grew, he became the prime suspect in Georgia's disappearance. The police wasted no time in paying him a visit, arriving at his home only to be met with silence. They knocked and waited, but there was no response. Desperate, they forced their way inside, but Jamie was nowhere to be found. His home was empty, and it was clear he had vanished. A manhunt for Jamie began in earnest, the police spreading word far and wide. Authorities were able to trace his movements to a petrol station, but no one there had seen either Jamie or Georgia. Their absences were peculiar, completely out of character for both of them. Despite attempts to contact his parents, who were unreachable on vacation, the authorities discovered crucial information: Jamie had a van, and it had been registered to him. This was the breakthrough they needed. With the registration in hand, the police sent out alerts across Shropshire, urging law enforcement nationwide to be on the lookout for Jamie. The search soon took an unexpected turn. Authorities tracked him to Glasgow, Scotland, more than 200 miles away from his home. His sudden departure from the area only heightened suspicions. Why would he flee so far? On May 30th, the Glasgow police apprehended Jamie at a modest hotel, where he had been staying under a false identity. They arrested him on suspicion of kidnapping, and he was immediately taken in for questioning. But Jamie remained tight-lipped, offering no explanation for Georgia's whereabouts. He claimed to know nothing about her, and the investigators were left with no solid answers. As Jamie was brought back to Shropshire for further questioning, Georgia's family anxiously awaited news. With each passing hour, their fear deepened, the uncertainty and dread gnawing at their insides. Finally, the police took the opportunity to search Jamie's home for any evidence that might shed light on Georgia's fate. What they found was disturbing beyond belief. Among the items they seized was a camera with an SD card. The officers hoped that the files on the card might provide a vital clue. But as they examined the files, their hopes were dashed. Every single image had been deleted. It seemed like another frustrating dead end, another obstacle to uncovering the truth. The camera was sent to forensic experts, who worked tirelessly to retrieve the deleted files. After hours of meticulous work, they were able to recover the images. What they found was chilling. The files contained several photos from the day of the photo shoot, showing Georgia in seemingly ordinary poses. But as they continued to inspect the pictures, a cold realization sank in: these were the final images of Georgia Williams, captured in the last moments before her disappearance. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and the haunting images would serve as a grim reminder of the mystery that still surrounded her fate. They say the dead can't speak, but if the bruises on Georgia's back could talk, they'd scream of the horror she endured in her final moments. Forensic specialists later revealed that the ligature wounds around her neck told only part of the story. The bruising across her back painted the rest, a clear imprint of a knee pressed down with force, pinning her small body into submission. Jamie Reynolds didn't just take her life, he crushed every last ounce of resistance she had. He made sure she couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't escape. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Reynolds sat in silence. He denied everything. In custody, he remained cold, unwavering, as if wearing a mask no one could tear off. But everything changed on the very first day of his trial in December 2013. Without a hint of warning, Jamie stood up and pled guilty to all charges. His courtroom confession left everyone stunned. It wasn't remorse that filled the room, it was dread, confusion, and a haunting silence. In the gallery, Georgia's father rose to speak. His voice trembled as he addressed the court, recounting the day he and his wife saw their daughter for the last time. Not in her bedroom, not at a family dinner, but lying lifeless in the sterile quiet of the hospital's chapel of rest. Her tiny frame, so still. Her face, once full of life, frozen in finality. That moment, he said, was burned into their souls, an image they could never unsee, a scar no passage of time could heal. But this story doesn't begin with Georgia's death. It begins with a string of ignored warnings, red flags that fluttered like storm signals in the wind. In 2008, 5 years before Georgia's murder, Jamie Reynolds was already known to authorities. He'd been issued what the court would later call a final warning after an alarming incident involving the confinement of another young girl, just 1 year old, inside his home. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't monitored. He was simply warned. Then in 2011, another disturbing incident, Reynolds reversed his car into the vehicle of a young woman who had rejected his advances. That case, too, fizzled out. But the judge during the murder trial, Mr. Justice Wilkie, saw a pattern. He described Reynolds as a sexual deviant, a man obsessed with violent pornography, spiraling towards something far more dangerous. It wasn't a matter of if, just when. And that, when, came in the form of Georgia's final, terrifying hours. Reynolds was sentenced to a whole life term, a punishment reserved for the most vile and calculated killers. No chance of parole. No future beyond prison walls. He became the youngest person in UK history to receive such a sentence. Mr. Justice Wilkie didn't mince words. In his statement, he described Georgia's final moments as a grotesque display of power, driven by Reynolds' twisted fixation on violent and sadistic pornography. Georgia hadn't died quickly. She had suffered, terribly. As the court displayed images of Georgia's final moments, her family could bear no more. Her mother and sister fled the room, their grief too great to contain. Reynolds bowed his head, not in humility, not in regret, but perhaps in recognition that his facade had finally cracked under the weight of the truth. Even after the trial, the horror didn't end. In 2014, Reynolds attempted to appeal his sentence. The appeal was denied. The next year, a serious case review was published. What it uncovered was damning. Law enforcement, children's services, and mental health professionals had all failed. They had all seen glimpses of the danger Reynolds posed, yet no one acted decisively. The review traced his escalating behavior all the way back to an incident where he had tried to strangle another young girl, 5 years before Georgia's death. Georgia's parents were heartbroken. As they read the report, they wept, not just for their daughter, but for all the missed chances to save her. It was so obvious, her mother said through tears, that Reynolds was, if not already, a murderer in the making. Georgia's death, they believed, could have been stopped. Outside the courtroom, Georgia's father, Mr. Williams, faced the press. "There is no sentence that will ever be enough," he said, his voice hollowed by grief. "Because nothing will bring Georgia back. She's gone. She lives only in our hearts." He spoke of the cruel irony. Reynolds, though imprisoned forever, still had the one thing he had stolen from their daughter, his life. To this day, Jamie Reynolds remains in prison. But for Georgia's family, the sentence is lifelong too. A grief that does not fade, a wound that does not heal. Georgia's mother, Lynette, later wrote a book titled Our Georgia, chronicling their journey through pain and betrayal. She poured her soul into its pages, confronting the horrifying truth that Reynolds, obsessed with snuff, films and violent sexual control, was free to walk the streets when he should have been locked away long before Georgia ever crossed his path. The book is more than a memoir. It's a cry for accountability. A tribute. A warning. Georgia's tragic death left behind more than grief, it left a haunting void. A silence too heavy for words. And yet, in that silence, her community found unity. Friends, neighbors, even strangers came together, offering support and love to the family she left behind. In their darkest hours, they were not alone. But still, the question lingers like a shadow: how many signs do we ignore before tragedy forces us to open our eyes? When investigators stepped into room 429 of the Sheraton Hotel, they weren't prepared for what they would uncover. What started as a quiet inquiry into a missing student spiraled into a grim and deeply disturbing tragedy, one that would haunt not just a family, not just a college campus, but an entire state. Behind that hotel room door lay the silent remnants of a family that, until days prior, had appeared picture-perfect to everyone who knew them. This is the chilling and heartbreaking story of the Parente family. William Michael Parente was born on July 20, 1949, in the working-class neighborhood of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. He was an only child raised by Willie and Rulon Parente, a reserved, conservative couple with deep ties to law enforcement. His father, a New York State trooper, ran a tight ship at home, instilling in young William a sense of order, restraint, and quiet discipline. Summers were spent on the shores of Long Beach, soaking in sunlight and simpler times. Despite his quiet nature, William grew into a diligent and ambitious student, eventually attending Brooklyn College and later, Brooklyn Law School. His legal education was made possible by the generosity of his uncle, Anthony J. Russo, who paid for his tuition. By the time he was working in a bustling office on Manhattan's Avenue of the Americas, William Parente had crafted a reputation as a courteous, meticulous estate attorney. Colleagues respected his professionalism, he was polite to a fault, never raised his voice, and was known for working long, focused hours. He didn't curse. He didn't attend after-work happy hours. He simply did his job and returned home to his family. In 1977, after passing the bar, William married Betty Mazzarella, a warm, social woman whose charm counterbalanced William's reserve. Betty was his anchor, and their bond only deepened with time. After years in the grind of Wall Street, William shifted into private practice when Betty became pregnant with their first child. The timing felt right, and the move allowed the family to settle in the peaceful, affluent suburb of Garden City, Long Island. To their neighbors, the Parentes were the embodiment of suburban success. Their home was modest but elegant, their lawn well-kept, and their routines predictable in the most comforting way. William ran his private law practice out of a small office in Queens. Betty, meanwhile, took charge of their home and played an active role in community life, organizing church fundraisers, attending social gatherings, and involving herself in school events. She was a familiar, smiling face around the neighborhood. They had two daughters, Stephanie and Catherine. Stephanie, the elder, was 19, bright, bubbly, and full of ambition. She was a sophomore at Loyola College in Maryland, studying speech pathology with plans to pursue dentistry. She was beloved by professors and friends alike. 11-year-old Catherine, or Katie as her friends called her, was a prodigy in the making, brilliant, creative, and admired by teachers at Garden City Middle School. Her intelligence, paired with an infectious curiosity, hinted at a dazzling future. But beneath the calm exterior of the Parente household, something had shifted. In the later years of his career, William began to dabble in an area of finance he described to friends and clients as bridge loans. In reality, it was murkier than that. Acting as a sort of unlicensed bank, he used client investments to fund short-term, high-interest loans, promising generous returns. But when one investor asked for their money back, and Parente couldn't deliver, it triggered a collapse he wasn't prepared for. The financial hole ran deeper than anyone knew. It was April 2009 when the Parente family made an unannounced trip to Maryland, under the guise of surprising Stephanie at college. They checked into room 429 at the Sheraton Hotel near Towson Town Center Mall. Their reservation was supposed to last until April 19. Stephanie's friends were puzzled by the timing. Classes had just resumed after Easter break, and Stephanie had a major chemistry exam coming up. Moreover, a campus meeting was already scheduled for April 17 to discuss her study abroad plans in England. Why the sudden detour? The visit began quietly. It seemed like a normal family weekend. But behind closed doors, something sinister was brewing, something no one saw coming. According to the evidence pieced together by investigators, the horror began on Sunday morning, April 19. Betty Parente was the first to be killed. She was attacked in her sleep, suffocated and beaten. No struggle. No screams. Just a brutal, calculated act of violence. Her lifeless body was left in bed. Next was Catherine. At just 11 years old, she too was smothered, placed beside her mother in what had become a makeshift tomb of silence. Hours passed. Later that day, Stephanie arrived at the hotel. Unaware of what had already unfolded behind that door, she stepped into the room, and into the same fate. She was killed and laid beside her mother and sister. 3 bodies. All neatly arranged on the bed. No signs of restraint. No drugs in their systems. Just stillness. Finality. The killer. William Parente, husband, father, lawyer. Sometime after murdering his entire family, he ended his own life. When hotel staff entered the room the next day after being unable to reach the occupants, the scene that awaited them was beyond comprehension. The media descended quickly. Neighbors were stunned. Investigators combed through financial records, legal files, and personal emails, trying to find any sign, any indication of what could drive a seemingly stable man to annihilate his entire family. What they uncovered painted a picture of financial despair. Parente's bridge loan scheme had been unraveling. He was facing lawsuits, investigations, and the possibility of losing everything, not just his livelihood, but his reputation, his future, his legacy. But why kill the ones he loved most? Why not confess, face justice, and let his family live? No one will ever know the true thoughts that haunted William Parente in those final days. Maybe he believed he was saving them from shame. Maybe his mind had already fractured under the weight of guilt and fear. Or maybe he was simply a man who could no longer see any path forward. The case of the Parente family stands as a sobering reminder that darkness doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes, it wears a suit. It smiles politely. It pays the bills on time and kisses its children goodnight. And then one day, it disappears, leaving behind only questions, sorrow, and a silence that echoes forever.